In part 1, we discussed how, according to Orthodox scripture, God made humanity in his own image, and that no convincing explanation can be found within the Orthodox narrative of how and in what way. In heterodox teachings, we found the same idea, again without explanation, but we were given some very interesting clues. According to these ideas, if we knew ourselves from a different point of view than is ordinarily the case, then we would see that God, the world, and humanity are designed in a like manner. That through knowing ourselves, we would be able to understand the universal design principles upon which the worlds of humanity, God, and the material universe are based. In part 2, we touched on some symbolic representations evident in Flood and Kirsch's Hermetic artworks, and we learned that 3 symbols, the circle, triad, and tetrad, were used to represent the design principles common to all worlds. And finally we looked at 2 symbols, the circle and the dyad, and discovered that at least to this point, the worlds of God, the universe, and humanity were fundamentally alike. I also mentioned that the dyad is an emergent property of the monad, and that the triad is implicit in the dyad, but this requires further explanation, as it will help us understand more complex symbolic representations, like the Kabbalah, later. In esoteric symbolism, the point or circle is used to illustrate the number 1 and the concept of a whole world complete within itself, and is sometimes called the monad. The line is used to carry the idea of the number 2. It represents the first division of any world and is referred to as the dyad. The circle, however, is also formed with a line and also creates a division, the world within the circle and the world outside of it. So it should be clear that in drawing a circle we represent 2 things. If we look carefully, we notice a third property in our rendering of the circle, the inner content of the circle, that which exists outside of the circle, and the point at which these 2 meet, which are neither one nor the other, or from another point of view, a synthesis of both the interior and the exterior of the circle. This idea is worth dwelling on because it carries the central principle of the esoteric religious triad, and that is, in order for anything at all to exist, 3 things must simultaneously exist. If this idea is missed, then it is quite hard to understand much about the esoteric religious triad. So we have the world inside the circle, which we will represent with a plus sign, contrasted with what is outside the circle, which we will represent with a minus sign, and the neutral point at which neither one nor the other exists, or they both exist together. We find this idea in the first triad of spheres in Fludds' artwork, which represents the Godhead. In the top sphere, we find the latent dualism in the monad, the point at which opposing elements exist together in potential, but also as neither one thing nor the other. There is a term in heterodox and orthodox religious nomenclature, the pleroma, which sums up this idea nicely, and they both contain similar ideas. Carl Jung had this to say about the pleroma, which also captures the idea nicely. The nothing or fullness is called by us the pleroma. In it, thinking and being cease, because the eternal is without qualities. In it there is no one, for if anyone were, they then would be differentiated from the pleroma. In the pleroma there is nothing and everything. The 2 spheres below the top sphere represent opposing principles. So the immaterial, omnipresent triad Godhead contains 3 aspects, 2 opposing qualities, and a synthesis of opposites. In the middle section, Flood shows us that the 2 opposing properties are represented in the physical world, our world, forming another triad. At the bottom of this picture, we find a third triad. Our world is an amalgam of the sensuous world, represented by Dionysus, and transcendent consciousness, or the spiritual for want of a better word, and the symbolic figure of Apollo. Dionysus and Apollo are two eminent sons of the supreme god of Greek mythology, Zeus, but their natures are completely opposite. Dionysus represents the dark side of Zeus. He is the god of chaos and is associated with unbridled sensuous pleasures, while Apollo, the god of order, is associated with the sun, illumination, and the higher faculties of God. The world of higher consciousness is contrasted with the sensuous world in the Dionysian and Eleusinian mysteries in much the same way as it is in the Eastern religious schools. Eastern and Western ascetics have historically worked on the premise that the world, the human body, and sensuous pleasures are inherently evil, and set about torturing their bodies and denying themselves pleasures, but the underlying idea is more nuanced than this. In the realm of our potential psycho-spiritual development, our motivating interests determine our direction. Clearly, if we are preoccupied by the sensuous world, satisfying base instincts and bodily pleasures, we cannot expect much. The interpretation of good and evil is a subjective thing, and conditioned by many things such as cultural morality, knowledge, depth of understanding, degrees of consciousness, religious influences, and so on. In effect, they are relative to individual desires, aims, and intentions. If, for instance, my intention is to abstain from consuming alcohol, then having wine is bad. On the other hand, if my aim is to become a wine expert, then drinking alcohol is good. So what constitutes morality, good and evil, right or wrong, is, at least in terms of human experience, purely subjective and changes over time, culture, and many other things. So ideas connected with the merit or otherwise of the sensuous world need to be taken in the context of psycho-spiritual development. Neither the body nor pleasure is evil, but preoccupation with one or the other will produce contrasting results along contrasting directions. We find this kind of narrative in the ideology of George Gurdjieff, and actually, if we consider the sensuous world as an inherent binary opposite of God, then this idea makes perfect sense. We can serve God, or we can serve nature. God wins either way. The broad theme of Eastern and Western esoteric religious literature is that we descend into the material world from a higher conscious plane of existence, and our arbitrary goal is either to work our way back up by following the path of Apollo, or continue our descent by taking the Dionysian route. Neither direction is good or evil in itself. Dionysus represents one aspect of God, Apollo another. In any case, we could make another sphere containing binary opposites, which represent the individual beneath Dionysus and Apollo, in which both lines of development reside in potential, and in doing so, we create a fourth triad. We will explore the origins of the ideas that Flood represents in this artwork a little later. But before leaving it, I would like to touch on another detail. If we fix our attention on the top triad again, we notice that the artist is drawing our attention to the idea that consciousness and matter are emergent properties of the pleroma. On the right-hand side of the top sphere, and in the sphere beneath it to the right, Flood is careful to show illumination, an idea that has been used since antiquity to connote consciousness. Illumination, or light, is the perfect metaphor for this idea, since the photons which compose light are not really matter in the usual sense of the term. Unlike other forms of matter, photons have no mass, and this enables them to reach the speed of light. Anything composed of matter has mass, and therefore cannot even reach the speed of light, let alone exceed it. So the photon is quite uniquely a kind of transcendent phenomena. So in the sphere which represents a material world, in keeping with esoteric religious tradition, Flood uses a sun as a representation of consciousness. When we explore legitimate esoteric religious symbolism, we deal exclusively in carefully chosen representations which most succinctly and accurately carry the underlying universal concepts and principles upon which every aspect of the all and everything is based. And this artwork of Fludds is a good example. Implicit in Fludds' rendering is the idea that matter is conscious, all of it. We like to think that we live in a universe surrounded by dead things, but an enduring concept of the religious, esoteric and philosophical worlds in the East and West is that everything is conscious to one degree or another, from the smallest quantum particle to the most massive galaxies. This idea is known as panpsychism, and we find it in the contemporary philosophy of Professor David Chalmers, geneticist Saul Wright, the ideology of Gurdjieff, Ouspensky and Carl Jung, who wrote, "Psyche and matter are contained in one and the same world, and moreover are in continuous contact with one another. It is probable that psyche and matter are two different aspects of one and the same thing." Panpsychism is essentially an esoteric religious idea and is particularly enduring. It predates Plato's concept of anima mundi, or world soul, and other variations of the same idea found in Greek and German philosophical schools. As we mentioned before, the problem with reductive materialism is that no one can describe how consciousness emerges from matter. The panpsychist worldview, that matter and consciousness are synchronous fundamental binary properties of the phenomenal world, resolves a problem of which emerge from which. And this is amongst the reason why panpsychism is once again enjoying a resurgence in academic circles, stripped, of course, of any religious references. In the next video, we will take a closer look at the world of God from the point of view of triadic arrangement, with particular emphasis on the origins of the Christian myth. Thanks for listening.